A teenage daughter's shocking discovery of her father's affair with her teacher unravels a web of secrets, betrayal, and deadly consequences. But what drove the sheriff's wife to commit murder, and how did it all begin? November 3rd, 2005, Willow Creek, Oregon, 11 p.m. In one house on Sycamore Street, a teenage girl named Megan Phillips sat in her room, staring at her phone in disbelief. She had just stumbled upon a series of messages on her father's computer, messages she wasn't supposed to see. As she scrolled through the emails, each one hit her like a punch to the gut. The messages were from her own teacher, Ms. Brooks. For weeks, Megan had suspected something was off. Her father, Dan Phillips, a man known around town as a family man, had been acting strange, secretive, distracted, always on his phone. But nothing could have prepared Megan for this. Megan felt her stomach twist as she read further. Her teacher wasn't just sending her father friendly messages. They were affectionate, full of secrets and promises. As the pieces fell into place, her mind raced. Her father, a man she'd always trusted, was hiding a secret that could tear their family apart. November 4th, Willow Creek High School, 8 a.m. The next morning, Megan walked through the hallways of Willow Creek High School, her mind heavy with confusion and anger. She spotted Ms. Brooks at her desk, acting like everything was normal. Megan's heart pounded as she fought the urge to confront her teacher right there. She felt betrayed by both Ms. Brooks and her own father. The knowledge weighed on her, and for the next few days, Megan's thoughts were consumed by the secret she'd uncovered. She wanted to tell someone, but she was afraid of the consequences. Would anyone even believe her? And if they did, what would happen to her family? The choices in front of her were daunting, but the anger within her was growing. She couldn't just sit back and do nothing. November 7th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 9 p.m. After struggling with the secret for days, Megan decided she couldn't bear it alone anymore. She called her best friend Jenna and told her everything. Jenna listened in shock, urging Megan to confront her father. It was clear to both of them that this affair wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal. Megan made up her mind. She was going to confront her father and demand the truth. She felt terrified, but she couldn't continue living in silence. November 8th, the Phillips home, 6:30 p.m. That evening, Megan waited for her father to come home. As he walked through the door, she steeled herself, gathering the courage to face him. She asked him straight out about the emails, her voice shaking with both fear and anger. Dan's face went pale, his usual calm demeanor crumbling. He knew he was caught. Dan tried to downplay it, telling her it was a misunderstanding, that it wasn't as serious as it seemed. But Megan wasn't convinced. She had seen the messages, seen the words that went far beyond any misunderstanding. She didn't buy his excuses, and her anger only grew. She told him that if he didn't end the affair, she would tell her mother and expose everything. Dan promised her that he would end it, that he'd make things right. But Megan couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. In her heart, she knew this was only the beginning of a far darker story. November 10th, Willow Creek High School, 3:15 p.m. 2 days after confronting her father, Megan kept a close eye on Ms. Brooks. She watched her teacher's every move, looking for any sign that the affair was over. But the more she observed, the more uneasy she felt. Ms. Brooks seemed tense, glancing toward the doorway whenever someone walked by and spending more time on her phone than usual. Megan sensed something was still going on, that her father hadn't ended things as he'd promised. By the end of the day, Megan's frustration had turned to anger. She couldn't believe her father's betrayal. The thought of him still sneaking around, lying to her and to her mother, made her feel sick. She knew she couldn't keep quiet much longer. November 12th, the Phillips home, 8 p.m. That night, Megan overheard her father on the phone. She could hear his low voice coming from his office, and though she couldn't make out every word, it was clear he wasn't talking to a friend or co-worker. Her heart sank as she recognized the tone, the same one she'd read in those emails. She didn't need to guess who was on the other end of that call. Megan clenched her fists, anger boiling inside her. It was clear he hadn't kept his word. He was still seeing Ms. Brooks, still lying to her and their family. She wanted to storm into his office, confront him, and demand answers. But instead she retreated to her room, her mind racing with plans to put an end to the lies once and for all. November 14th, Willow Creek High School, 2:30 p.m. Megan's anger had reached a breaking point, and she decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. That afternoon, she waited until Ms. Brooks's classroom was empty. With her heart pounding, she walked up to her teacher's desk, fixing her with a hard stare. Ms. Brooks looked up, surprised by the intensity in Megan's eyes. Megan didn't waste any time. She told her that she knew about the affair, that she had seen the messages, and that if Ms. Brooks didn't end it immediately, she would expose everything. She made it clear that she was done with the lies, done with the deception, and wouldn't let her family be torn apart. Ms. Brooks looked stunned, her face pale as she realized the gravity of the situation. She stammered out a weak promise to end things, but Megan didn't trust her any more than she trusted her father. She knew she would have to stay vigilant. November 16th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 7 p.m. Later that week, Megan noticed a shift in her father's behavior. He seemed more distant, more agitated, as if he knew the walls were closing in. He barely looked at her or her mother, and he spent hours locked away in his office. It was clear that the pressure was getting to him. But Megan's confrontation had done more than just unsettle him. It had pushed him to desperation. Unknown to Megan, he had called Ms. Brooks, frantic and angry, urging her to keep quiet and threatening her if she didn't. He was determined to protect his image, even if it meant pushing things further than he'd intended. Megan's actions had started a chain reaction, one that would soon lead to consequences far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. November 18th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 9 p.m. A week had passed since Megan confronted Ms. Brooks, and the atmosphere in the Phillips home had only grown more tense. Dan's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was jumpy, snapping at the slightest things and avoiding both Megan and her mother. Megan sensed that he was spiraling, that the weight of his secrets was pushing him to the edge. She wondered if he realized she would make good on her promise to expose him if he didn't end the affair. One evening, as Megan sat in the living room, she saw her father leaving the house. His face was tense, his steps hurried. Her mother asked where he was going, but Dan brushed her off with a vague excuse. He was meeting an old friend, he said, and left without another word. Megan's suspicions flared. She waited a few minutes, then slipped out to follow him, curiosity and anger spurring her on. November 18th, Willow Creek Motel, 9:30 p.m. Megan kept her distance as she followed her father's car through town, her heart pounding. She knew this was risky, but she had to know the truth. She watched as he pulled into the parking lot of a small, run-down motel on the outskirts of Willow Creek. Her stomach twisted as she saw Ms. Brooks step out from the shadows and approach his car. They talked for a few moments, their gestures frantic. Megan couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could feel the tension from where she was hiding. She saw her father grab Ms. Brooks's arm, his face set in a fierce expression. Ms. Brooks looked shaken, her body language defensive, as if she was trying to distance herself from him. It was clear they were in a heated argument. Megan felt her heart race, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. Her father had been lying all along. He was still seeing Ms. Brooks despite everything. She wanted to scream, to confront them both, but she forced herself to stay hidden, watching as they continued to argue. November 20th, the Phillips home, 11 p.m. 2 days later, the tension at home had reached a boiling point. Megan's father was now visibly on edge, his every move filled with a quiet desperation. That night, After everyone had gone to bed, Megan overheard him on the phone again. His voice was low, angry, as he spoke in hushed tones to Ms. Brooks. Megan's stomach twisted as she listened to bits and pieces of the conversation. "You can't back out now. We'll both lose everything. I told you to keep quiet," he hissed into the phone. The desperation in his tone was unmistakable. It was clear he was losing control, and he was terrified of the consequences. Megan stayed awake, trying to piece everything together. She knew she couldn't keep this hidden much longer. Her father was falling apart, and the longer the secret stayed buried, the more dangerous it seemed to become. November 22nd, Willow Creek High School, 4 p.m. The next day, Megan made a decision. She went to the school counselor, Mrs. Jensen, and confided everything: the affair, her father's threats, and the way it was tearing her family apart. She needed someone to help, someone who could intervene before things spiraled any further. Mrs. Jensen listened intently, her face a mixture of shock and concern. She promised Megan she would address the issue, but she urged her to be cautious, warning that exposing something like this could have serious repercussions. But Megan had already reached her breaking point. She was tired of the lies, the deceit, and the fear that had gripped her family. She knew that bringing this to light might change everything, but she was ready. November 23rd, Willow Creek High School, 8:30 a.m. The following morning, the school counselor, Mrs. Jensen, approached Ms. Brooks, pulling her aside for a private conversation. Mrs. Jensen confronted her about the allegations, making it clear that this was no longer a secret. Ms. Brooks's face turned pale, and she quickly became defensive, insisting that Megan had misunderstood, that there was nothing improper going on. But Mrs. Jensen had already seen the toll it was taking on Megan, and she warned Ms. Brooks that if there was any truth to these claims, the school would have no choice but to take action. Ms. Brooks felt the walls closing in. She knew her reputation, and possibly her career, was hanging by a thread. After their conversation, Ms. Brooks called Dan, frantic and furious. She told him about the meeting with Mrs. Jensen and warned him that they were running out of time. She couldn't keep up the charade any longer. Dan, hearing the panic in her voice, realized he was losing control over the situation. Desperation clawed at him, and he urged her to meet with him one last time to figure out a plan. November 23rd, Willow Creek Park, 10 p.m. That night, Dan and Ms. Brooks met at Willow Creek Park, a quiet, deserted spot far from prying eyes. The air was cold, and the park was nearly empty, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the darkness. They walked to a secluded area, their voices tense and hushed as they argued over what to do next. Ms. Brooks insisted that they needed to end everything immediately. She couldn't risk losing her job, her life, her reputation. But Dan, his mind racing with fear and anger, felt trapped. He knew if the affair came out, he would lose his family, his standing in the community, and possibly even his job. In his desperation, he begged her to keep quiet just a little longer. But Ms. Brooks shook her head, standing firm. She was done with the lies, done with the deceit. She told him that if he didn't end things now, she would go to the authorities herself and tell them everything. Dan felt a surge of panic as he realized she was serious. His mind swirled with dark thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. In that moment, he saw his entire life slipping away. A terrible silence filled the air. Then, in a desperate, reckless moment, Dan snapped. He lunged at Ms. Brooks, his anger boiling over, and the two struggled, their voices echoing through the empty park. She tried to break free, to scream, but he overpowered her, his hands tightening around her throat. In a horrifying instant, the struggle ended, and Ms. Brooks fell silent. Dan stared down at her lifeless body, the reality of what he'd done crashing over him like a tidal wave. Panic set in, and he knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't leave any trace of what had happened here. November 24th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 2 a.m. Under the cover of darkness, Dan dragged Ms. Brooks's body to a nearby clearing, covering her with leaves and debris. He tried to erase any sign of their struggle, his hands shaking as he worked, but no amount of effort could undo what he had just done. He knew that sooner or later someone would find her. He knew that Megan was already suspicious, and he knew that his life, as he knew it, was over. As he returned home in the early hours of the morning, Dan couldn't shake the horror of what he had done. He was haunted by Ms. Brooks's last terrified expression, the silence that had followed. He washed his hands over and over, scrubbing away invisible stains, but the guilt clung to him, suffocating him with every passing second. Now, all he could do was hope that no one would discover his secret. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time. November 25th, Willow Creek High School, 8 a.m. The following morning, whispers filled the halls of Willow Creek High School. Ms. Brooks hadn't shown up for class, and no one seemed to know where she was. Teachers and students exchanged glances, wondering what could have happened. Megan noticed the tense atmosphere and felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She couldn't help but wonder if her father had something to do with her teacher's sudden disappearance. By midday, the school principal made an announcement asking anyone with information on Ms. Brooks's whereabouts to come forward. Megan's anxiety grew and her mind raced with possibilities. She thought about the confrontation she'd witnessed between her father and Ms. Brooks at the motel and her father's erratic behavior since then. She felt a gnawing sense of dread as the pieces started to come together. November 26th, the Phillips home, 11:30 p.m. That night, unable to shake her suspicions, Megan confronted her father once again. She asked him if he knew anything about Miss Brooks's disappearance, her voice trembling with fear. Dan froze, his face a mixture of shock and panic. He tried to play it off, insisting he didn't know anything, but Megan could see the guilt in his eyes. He was hiding something, and she was more certain than ever that he was involved. Growing desperate, Megan pressed him further, telling him that if he didn't tell her the truth, she would go to the police. Dan's composure cracked, and he pleaded with her not to say anything. He told her that things had gotten out of hand, that he had been forced into doing something he never wanted to do. But he wouldn't say exactly what he had done, and Megan's fear only deepened. November 27th, Willow Creek Police Department, 8 a.m. The next morning, Megan couldn't keep the secret any longer. She went to the Willow Creek Police Department and told them everything she knew. She spoke about the affair, her father's behavior, the motel meeting, and her suspicions about Ms. Brooks's disappearance. The officers listened carefully, taking her words seriously. Megan felt a mix of relief and terror as she left the station. She had done what she felt was right, but she knew this could tear her family apart. Later that day, the police launched an official search for Ms. Brooks, combing through her recent phone records, emails, and known locations. Megan's information led them to the last place she'd been seen, the park where Dan had met her that night. The officers scoured the area, searching for any signs that could shed light on her disappearance. November 28th, Willow Creek Park, 3 p.m. By afternoon, the search team discovered a disturbed patch of ground in a secluded area of the park. As they dug, a terrible sight emerged: the partially hidden body of Ms. Brooks. Her face was bruised, her clothing torn, and the evidence of a violent struggle was clear. The news sent shockwaves through the small town, leaving everyone in horror and disbelief. That evening, the police brought Dan in for questioning. Megan watched as her father was led away in handcuffs, his face blank with shock and defeat. Her heart ached as she saw him leave, knowing that she had set this in motion, that her actions had exposed a terrible truth. But she also knew she had done the right thing. During the interrogation, Dan broke down. Faced with the evidence against him, he confessed to the crime. He admitted to the affair, the desperation, and the argument in the park that had escalated into violence. He insisted it was a moment of blind rage, a mistake that he couldn't take back. But his confession did little to ease the horror of what he'd done. November 29th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 6 a.m. The news of Dan's confession spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Neighbors and friends who had once seen Dan as a devoted family man now looked at him with contempt and horror. The community was shaken, and Megan's family was shattered, struggling to come to terms with the reality of who Dan truly was. Megan couldn't escape the guilt that weighed on her, knowing that she had exposed the truth, but also feeling responsible for the outcome. She had believed that revealing the affair would stop the lies, but instead it had unraveled into a nightmare she could never have imagined. As she looked out at the town she'd grown up in, now marred by scandal and tragedy, Megan realized that their lives would never be the same. The secret she had uncovered had destroyed everything, and there was no going back. December 1st, Willow Creek, Oregon, 9 a.m. The fallout from Dan's confession rocked Willow Creek. The Phillips family, once seen as a symbol of stability, now found themselves the center of a scandal that had shattered the town's quiet image. The residents struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the reality of what he had done. Everywhere Megan went, she felt eyes on her, whispering, judging, and wondering how she could ever have exposed her own father. At school, Megan felt isolated. Her friends kept their distance, unsure of what to say, while the teachers looked at her with a mix of pity and discomfort. The weight of the situation was almost unbearable, but she held her head high, determined not to let the shame consume her. She had done the right thing, she reminded herself, even if it felt like her world was falling apart. December 5th, Willow Creek Courthouse, 11 a.m. Dan's arraignment was a media frenzy. Reporters from nearby cities flooded the courthouse, covering every moment of the case. He was charged with second-degree murder, with bail set impossibly high. As he entered the courtroom in shackles, the air was thick with tension. Megan sat in the back, her mother by her side, watching the man who had once been the center of their lives, now reduced to a figure of scandal and infamy. During the hearing, Dan's defense attorney argued that the incident had been a crime of passion, not premeditated murder. They claimed he'd been under immense stress, that his actions had stemmed from desperation. But the prosecution painted a much darker picture, one of manipulation and a pattern of deceit. They were adamant that Dan should face the full consequences of his actions. The judge agreed with the prosecution, refusing to reduce the charges. Dan would remain in custody until the trial, a reality that crushed whatever hope the Phillips family might have had of a quick resolution. The trial date was set, and Megan knew the road ahead would be long and painful. December 10th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 7 p.m. Back at home, Megan's mother, Sarah, tried to hold the family together, though the strain showed in every gesture, every tired glance. She had lost her husband to betrayal, her family to scandal, and her daughter was caught in the middle of a nightmare. The two rarely spoke about what had happened, each carrying the burden in silence. They barely recognized the life they were now living. Megan, too, was haunted by guilt and grief. Every corner of their home reminded her of the family they'd once been, of the man her father had been before everything had fallen apart. She couldn't escape the feeling that, in exposing the affair, she had somehow set this all in motion. But she knew it was a choice her father had made, a choice that had cost them everything. December 12th, Willow Creek Police Station, 6 p.m. Then an unexpected twist threw the town into even deeper shock. Dan Phillips escaped custody while being transferred to the courthouse for a pre-trial hearing. The police vehicle had been involved in a car accident on the highway, and amid the chaos, Dan had managed to slip away, evading the officers in the confusion. News of his escape spread quickly, and fear gripped Willow Creek. The police launched a manhunt, combing through the surrounding areas, interviewing anyone who might have seen him. For Megan and her mother, the nightmare intensified. Not only was Dan a fugitive, but now they feared he might come after them. After all, it was Megan's decision to expose the affair that had led to his arrest, and they couldn't be sure how desperate he might be now. December 13th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 10 p.m. That night, Megan and her mother locked every door and window, unable to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside made them jump. They knew Dan was out there somewhere, and the thought of him coming back, filled with anger and resentment, kept them on edge. Megan's mind raced with everything she had uncovered and the dark path it had led them down. She could hardly believe that her own father had turned into someone she now feared. The police patrolled the neighborhood, but Megan and her mother knew that if Dan was determined to evade capture, he could stay hidden for a long time. They prayed the police would find him before he found them. December 15th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 8 a.m. The town was on edge. News of Dan Phillips's escape spread fear among the residents of Willow Creek. People locked their doors, kept their children close, and eyed every stranger with suspicion. Local law enforcement and nearby agencies ramped up their search efforts, combing through forests, abandoned buildings, and any place Dan might have used as a hideout. Each day that passed without finding him only heightened the tension. Megan and her mother lived in constant fear, barely leaving the house, waiting for news that he had been captured. Megan's guilt had transformed into terror. She couldn't shake the feeling that her father's escape was somehow her fault. She had been the one to expose him, and she couldn't stop thinking he might be coming for her next. December 18th, the Phillips home, 2:30 a.m. Late at night, Megan lay wide awake in bed, the silence of the house amplifying every small sound. She thought she heard something outside, a faint rustling near the window. Her heart pounded as she strained to listen, her mind filled with images of her father lurking in the shadows. She considered waking her mother, but the thought of worrying her even more held her back. She lay there, frozen, hoping it was only her imagination. The next morning, they found footprints outside the house, near the windows, in the soft earth where the frost hadn't settled. Megan and her mother's worst fears seemed to be coming true. They called the police, who took photos and checked the area, but they found no sign of Dan nearby. Megan was shaken to her core, terrified that her father was closer than they thought. December 20th, Willow Creek Police Department, 9 p.m. Detective Rachel Monroe, who was leading the manhunt, updated the media and community, urging everyone to stay vigilant and report any suspicious activity. She assured the town that they were working tirelessly to bring Dan back into custody. But privately, Detective Monroe knew they were running out of leads. Dan had been clever, avoiding cameras, disguising his trail, and staying hidden in ways that made him nearly impossible to track. Meanwhile, Megan and her mother were growing more and more desperate. They moved into a hotel temporarily, hoping it would give them a sense of security, but Megan knew they couldn't hide forever. She felt trapped, helpless, and constantly haunted by the thought of her father finding them. December 23rd, Willow Creek, Oregon, 4 p.m. On the third day in the hotel, Megan received a call from an unknown number. Her hand trembled as she picked up, dreading who it might be. To her horror, it was Dan. His voice was calm, almost chillingly so. He told her that she had ruined everything, that her decision to expose him had left him with nothing. His words were laced with bitterness and blame, but beneath it all, Megan could hear the desperation. He wanted her to know how much she had destroyed his life, but she could also sense the pain of a man who had lost all control. She hung up, shaken and terrified. She immediately told her mother and called the police, who tracked the call to a nearby payphone. But by the time officers arrived, Dan was long gone, leaving only a faint reminder of how close he could get when he wanted to. December 24th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 11:30 p.m. Christmas Eve was supposed to be a time of peace and family, but for Megan and her mother, it was anything but. They had barricaded themselves in their temporary residence, fearing what might happen next. Megan felt the weight of her father's words pressing down on her, the realization of how deep his anger went. Then, just before midnight, they heard a knock at the door. Megan's mother looked at her, terror in her eyes, and they both held their breath. A police officer called out, reassuring them it was safe to open the door. Detective Monroe stepped inside, her expression serious but calm. "We've located him," she said. "Dan was spotted on the outskirts of town, near an old cabin he used to frequent." The relief was palpable, but it was mixed with dread. Detective Monroe explained that they were closing in on him, and she assured them that by morning it would be over. December 25th, Old Cabin, Willow Creek Forest, 2 a.m. The police surrounded the old cabin, and after a tense standoff, Dan finally emerged. He was tired, disheveled, and clearly defeated. He tried to bargain, to negotiate his way out, but Detective Monroe's team wasn't taking any chances. When he made a sudden move, they acted quickly, resulting in a swift, final encounter that left Dan fatally injured. December 25th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 6 a.m. As the sun rose on Christmas morning, Megan and her mother received the news. Dan was gone, and with him, the fear that had shadowed their lives for weeks. It was a bittersweet end, bringing relief, but also a profound sense of loss. The man they had once loved had destroyed himself through secrets, lies, and a violent obsession that had ultimately led to his death. Megan felt a complex wave of emotions: sadness, relief, guilt, and exhaustion. She knew it would take time to heal, that the scars of her father's choices would remain with her forever. But as she and her mother embraced, they knew they had a chance to start over, a chance to rebuild and find peace after the storm. January 3rd, Willow Creek, Oregon, 9 a.m. The new year dawned in Willow Creek, but the scars left by Dan Phillips's actions lingered throughout the small town. For Megan and her mother, the weeks following his death were a haze of grief, relief, and reflection. They had been through a nightmare, and the emotional weight was immense. Friends and family reached out, offering condolences and support, but the pain remained raw, too fresh to truly heal. Megan struggled with conflicting feelings, relief that her father could no longer harm them, but a lingering guilt for having been the one to expose his secrets in the first place. She questioned her actions, wondered if things could have turned out differently, but deep down, she knew that the truth would have come out eventually. Her father had made his choices that had led him down a dark and destructive path. She couldn't shoulder the blame for his actions. January 15th, Willow Creek High School, 8:30 a.m. Returning to school was difficult for Megan. She felt the stares and heard the whispers, students and teachers still reeling from the events that had rocked their town. But despite the murmurs, a few friends stepped forward, offering a quiet, steady support that reminded her she wasn't alone. She was surprised to find strength within herself, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Her relationship with her mother grew stronger as they faced their new reality together. They spent hours talking about everything they'd been through, processing the pain, and vowing to be open and honest with each other from then on. They leaned on each other, finding comfort in the bond that had only deepened through their shared struggle. February 2nd, Willow Creek Counseling Center, 11 a.m. Megan and her mother began attending therapy sessions to process the trauma they had experienced. The counselor guided them through the layers of grief, betrayal, and fear that had defined their lives for months. With time, they started to release the guilt and pain they had carried, learning to separate themselves from the choices Dan had made. Through therapy, Megan began to see herself not as the cause of her family's unraveling, but as a survivor, someone who had the courage to confront a dark truth, even if it had come at a tremendous cost. She learned to forgive herself and eventually to forgive her father in her own way. She came to understand that his actions were his own and that she couldn't bear the weight of his decisions. March 5th, Willow Creek, Oregon, 5 p.m. The town slowly moved on, but Megan and her mother continued to rebuild their lives with purpose and intention. They found new routines, created new memories, and embraced the chance to start fresh. Though they knew they'd never forget the past, they also knew they couldn't let it define their future. On a sunny afternoon, Megan and her mother visited the park where everything had first come to light. It was a quiet, reflective moment, a chance to lay the past to rest. They walked in silence, feeling the weight of what had happened, but also a sense of peace that had come from confronting it head-on. They had faced the darkness, endured the unimaginable, and survived. As they left the park, Megan felt a renewed strength within her. The pain would always be a part of her story, but it no longer held her captive. She was free, free to find her own path, her own peace, and to live a life defined not by her father's choices, but by her own resilience and courage.